What's up, y'all? It's Den. Welcome back to NOTA Studios, even though right now I'm in my bedroom. Today, I wanted to talk about compression. If you're a beginner music producer, or maybe you're an artist who goes to the studio often, maybe you've heard of compression, but you're confused about it and don't really understand what it is. Well, in this video, I'd like to explain what compression is, what it's really doing, what all those little knobs mean, and how you can confidently set it every single time. I want to keep it simple so everyone can understand. Let's keep it quick and easy. So what is compression? In the simplest terms, without explaining too much, compression is simply turning down the volume. That's it. Or at least that's how you can think about it for now, just so you can understand. A compressor will reduce or compress the volume of a sound. This is important because this helps us control something called dynamics. Dynamics are the difference between the loudest parts of our song and the quietest parts of our song. If our dynamics are uncontrolled or too different, then our song is not going to sound cohesive and it's not going to sound like very good quality. On my computer here, I have a graphic that shows what compression does pretty well. This is a picture of a waveform. This waveform can tell us how loud or quiet something is based on how tall or short it is. In this before picture, we can see that the front part of this waveform is very loud and the back or tail of this waveform is very quiet. In this after picture, this is after compression has been applied, we can see that we've reduced the volume of those loud peaks at the beginning of the waveform, and these quieter peaks weren't affected as much. In this comparison, we can see just how much the volume was reduced in these loud peaks and just how little the quieter peaks were affected. Now, this is because of something called the threshold. The threshold determines at which point the compressor is going to start working. And we can see that here with this yellow line. Once the waveform passes this yellow line, then the compressor will start to reduce those peaks. They also describe that here as well. Audio that's below the threshold is unaffected, and audio above the threshold is reduced in volume. Now, how much the volume is reduced is dependent on what's called the ratio. I pulled up this graphic on my computer to help show what the ratio is doing. Ratios, if you think back to math class, they're relational. So we have 1 to 1, 2 to 1, 4 to 1, 10 to 1. This is typically what ratios will look like. And what this is saying is this is the relation between our input and our output. So the volume that comes into our compressor, or the volume that is above our threshold really, versus our output level. So how much volume we're allowing out of the compressor. So for a 2 to 1 ratio, we have 2 decibels in to 1 decibel out. So for every 2 decibels above our threshold, the compressor is only going to allow 1 decibel of output. I know it's a lot of math, and this is why people generally don't understand compression. The ratio is probably the most complicated part of the compressor, but it is pretty simple. Here's a way that I like to think about ratios, and it helped me understand compression so much better. Now, ratios are basically just fractions. That's it. So for a 2 to 1 ratio, if 2 decibels goes in and 1 decibel comes out, then I reduced my volume by half, or 1 over 2. Now, for a 4 to 1 ratio, it's the same thing. You reverse the ratio and it becomes a fraction, which shows how much gain reduction you're getting. If I have 4 decibels of input and 1 decibel of output, then I've reduced my volume to 1/4 of the original volume, or 1 over 4. You can do this for every ratio. For a 10 to 1 ratio, the compressor will reduce my volume down to 1/10 of what the original volume was. Hopefully that helps you out. That is the simplest way that I can think of to explain ratios. Now that I've explained what compression is, why it's so important, and what the threshold and the ratio are, we can put this into play and you can actually see what compression is doing. So I pulled these samples in from Splice, and I tried to pick samples that had a wide range of dynamics, especially these drums here. We can see that the difference between the quietest parts, which are these hi-hats here, and the loudest parts, which is these snares, there's a huge difference. These are extremely quiet and these snares are super loud. I picked a guitar because guitars generally have a wide range of dynamics because of the plucking from the guitar strings. These vocals are pretty much already compressed, and I can tell just because the dynamics are pretty consistent, but there is this part at the end that just, the volume jumps up out of nowhere. So I think that we can add a compressor to that to just control this random peak down here and also this random peak up here too. But I also purposefully, I gain staged the guitar and the drum loop, and I did not gain stage the vocals so that we can use compression in order to help fit the vocals into our song better. I don't know how loud this is going to be for you. Hopefully not too loud, but I'm going to play this all together so you can see what's wrong with it. As you can see, first of all, the vocals are just way too loud. They just don't fit in our song very well. This drum loop, obviously the snare is just too loud. The hi-hats are too quiet. And this guitar, the guitar sounds good only because I gain staged it, but I feel like we can still control the dynamics a little bit more and help it fit just a little bit better. So I'm going to open up my mixer, and I already have 3 channels made for my guitar, drum loop, and the vocal samples. I open up what's called Fruity Limiter. I'm using FL Studio, but what I'm showing you applies to every DAW. The Fruity Limiter is a limiter and a compressor, basically just a compressor, but it has these 2 different sections at the bottom, one for the limiter and one for the compressor. I'm going to be using the compressor function. Now we can see here we have all these knobs, 2 of which we have talked about already, the threshold and the ratio. I'm going to play this again, and I'm going to set my compressor for the guitar. The vocals are just too distracting, so I'm going to turn those off. There are many different ways that you can set your compressor. A very popular method is to set the threshold first and then slowly bring down your ratio until it sounds like you're reducing the volume enough. So I'm going to do that because I know that I don't want a lot of compression on this sample. So I'm going to set my threshold so that it is sitting somewhere close to the body of the waveform, somewhere underneath the peaks where an average of all of the volume of the sound is. And then I'm going to slowly turn down my ratio until the peaks aren't as loud as they were before. So I think somewhere around 1.8 to 1 or 2 to 1 ratio sounds good. I might bring this back up to 2 to 1. I like how flat it sounded, but it still has some of its dynamics there. Yeah, that sounds pretty controlled to me. I like that. A lot of these other knobs you're not going to see on every type of compressor. You are going to have a threshold. You are going to have a ratio. Absolutely. The 4 main controls that you'll see on a compressor are the threshold, the ratio, the attack, and the release. You will see the knee sometimes too. The knee basically is the transition between not being compressed and being compressed. Right? It's the transition between the compressor being active and the compressor being not active. If we turn the knee up, it's going to be a harder transition. If we turn the knee down, it's going to be a softer transition. So the attack and the release basically determine how long the compressor is going to be active for. The attack is how long it takes for the compressor to be active. Right now, my attack is set to 0 milliseconds. So as soon as the volume comes above the threshold, the compressor is going to start acting immediately. The release determines how long after the compressor's activation will it be compressing in total. You would assume, based on what you've learned today, that all compressors would start working immediately anyways, but in some instances, you do want a little bit of a delay. So like on drums or things that have kind of a snap to them, you want to let some of that volume through if you want to maintain that punch or maintain that snap, and then you would compress the tail of that. Now we can use the release to control that tail and how it sounds. If we set the release too short or too low, then we won't really hear the compression working. That tail, the volume of the tail will just come right back up and it'll be too loud. And if we set the release too high, then we can smash the tail too much and completely lose our dynamics. Setting the attack and release is going to require some ear training, and you're going to have to learn what it is that you're listening for. A good way to start learning how to use these is the next time you use a compressor, keep the attack and the release at their default settings, set your threshold, set your ratio, get the amount of volume reduction that you're looking for, and then turn the attack all the way up. You're not going to hear the compression anymore because it's taking the compressor too long to act. Then start to turn the attack down until you start to hear the compressor working again. And then you can basically do the same thing with the release. Set the release all the way down. You will barely hear it acting on the tail end of the sound anymore. Then you can increase the level of the release until you start to hear the compressor working again. It's going to take some time to train your ear to learn what to listen for when setting the attack and release, but just do this, practice it. This is what helped me out. Another knob that you'll see on a lot of compressors will be gain. It'll either be one knob, which just says gain on it, or it'll be two. It'll say input and output. Whenever you just see one gain knob, it's going to be the overall output of the compressor or the overall volume. Since I already gain staged this and I like the volume that it's at, I'm not going to mess with the gain. All right, now let's move on to the drums. For the drums, I'm going to use a different compressor just to show you the similarities between all compressors. This is the M compressor from Melda Audio. Fantastic plugin bundle, all for free too. They have so many options. They have pitch correction in there, reverb, delay, EQ, and compressor, obviously. Looking at this compressor, we can see some of the same controls, same knobs that we saw in the Fruity Limiter. We have our threshold, we have our ratio, we have the attack, the release, and then we have the input and output, which is our gain. We also have knee on here, but instead of a knob, we have different modes. So we have a hard knee, linear knee, soft knee, and you can see the way that it's changing the shape of the slope right around our threshold, which is this red line. So linear, it makes it kind of straight. Hard, it makes it an angle, and then soft, it kind of rounds it out. So there's a transition between uncompressed and compressed. I'm going to set this compressor a little bit differently than I set the Fruity Limiter for my guitar. I'm going to start by setting the ratio to 4:1 because I know I want to compress this a lot more than I compressed the guitar. I'm also going to set my attack to 0 as well, and I'll keep my release at 50 milliseconds just because that's default. So my camera died, so I just went ahead and set the compressor settings for the drum loop while my camera was charging. So I have my threshold set at -21 decibels, my ratio at 4:1, and you'll see up here I set my attack to 30 milliseconds instead of 0. And the reason I did this is because drums are supposed to be punchy, so I want that initial snap from the snare to come through so it actually feels like it's hitting you. I also increased the input level by 4 decibels to make it a little bit louder. All right, now you can still hear some of that snap from the snare. I'm going to turn down the attack so you can hear how muffled the snare was getting with the attack at 0. So you see when it was set to 0, the compressor was acting immediately and it was squashing down the snare so much we didn't have that snap anymore. Again, it's important to control the dynamics, not completely flatten out the dynamics, but we want to control the distance in the dynamics, how far apart they are. So the hi-hats now sound louder and the snare is more controlled and not too loud. I did not set this release. I think 50 milliseconds makes sense for drums because drums are snappy, they're quick. So we don't want the compressor to be acting for a long time and completely smashing down all of the hi-hat hits or all of the snare hits. So 50 milliseconds is fine. I'll just leave it at that. All right, next we're gonna work on these vocals. I'm going to use the fruity limiter just because it makes it easier to see the waveform. I do actually prefer the M compressor, but you know, this compressor, the visual on this compressor is very nice when you're learning. Again, I'm gonna set my threshold first and then I'll set my ratio. So Fruity Limiter also has this pretty nice helper. There's this blue line that kind of follows the waveform. I don't know if you can see it, but it kind of helps you set your compressor at a good threshold level. Yeah, that line looks good to me. I'm comparing that line to the rest of the waveform. I don't want to affect any of the volume underneath that. Now I'm just going to start turning up my ratio until it sounds good. All right, I think that sounds pretty good. I'm gonna check it one more time. I'm gonna increase the ratio to like 6 and just hear what it sounds like. So I'm just going to set the ratio at 4:1. I compared 3:1 to 6:1, and I didn't hear too much of a difference. It sounded good both ways to me. 4:1 is a pretty average compression ratio, and it sounds pretty good here. So I'm just going to leave it at that. With this vocal, I don't want it to have punch, right? So I'm okay with the attack being set at 0 milliseconds, but I do want to set this release because I want to make sure that it is compressing properly, like for the proper amount of time for my ear. I'm going to show you what I'm listening out for. So right here at this very end, this peak, like I can hear that getting extremely loud. So I'm actually just going to loop this. And I'm going to set my release while just looping that. Sorry if that was annoying. I tried to do it quickly. Let's see where I set it. I set it at 350 milliseconds. I feel like where I set it at, the compression sounds pretty smooth and everything sounds cohesive like that. The vocal is still too loud, and I'll show you what to do for that in a second. But for now, this vocal isn't piercing my ears at certain points. It sounds very smooth. Yeah, it sounds pretty consistent across the whole song. Now I'm going to use this gain knob in order to set my final volume for the vocal so it actually sits where I want it to sit in the song. I'm going to turn the gain all the way down so you won't be able to hear anything, and then I'm going to slowly bring it up until it's sitting where I want it. That sounds good to me. That's about where I want it to sit. It feels like it's right in between the guitar and the drums. Now, it could have sounded better at a different volume to you. There is no guideline to determine how much gain is enough. It's really just your ear, and you really need to know your speakers and know what you're looking for. And this sounds good to me, right? So don't Don't just copy my settings for what I'm doing. Like, really get into it, play around with all of these knobs and go to extremes, turn knobs all the way down, turn them all the way up, and like slowly increase them, slowly decrease them until it's starting to sound good to you. All right, that's it. I hope that was all clear. Again, tried to make it as simple as possible for you. Didn't want to give you any information that you didn't need. But if you have any more questions or want to know more, leave a comment down below. I would love to get more into this. I've barely scratched the surface when it comes to compressors, so maybe that'll be a video in the future. All right.